The Galactic Senate chamber descended into its traditional pre-session chaos at precisely 8:57 Standard Galactic Time, which was 3 minutes before the ceremonial gongs were supposed to restore order. Representatives from 47 species were engaged in what could charitably be called animated discussion, and more accurately described as controlled pandemonium with diplomatic immunity. High Chancellor Vextura's 4 eyes swept across the chamber with the weary expression of someone who had spent 2 centuries trying to get politicians to agree on basic concepts like "please don't eat the other delegates." His ceremonial staff, a meter-long crystal that supposedly contained the concentrated wisdom of ages, but mostly just looked expensive, remained firmly planted on his desk as he waited for the arguing to die down. "The 847th session of the Galactic Senate will come to order," he announced, his voice carrying across the chamber through translation systems that had been working overtime to convert the morning's insults into diplomatically acceptable language. "The Senate recognizes the newest member delegation from the Sol system, representing the species designation human from the third planet." Every eye, sensor array, and sensory organ in the chamber turned toward Section 47C, the hastily constructed seating area that had been added just 3 weeks ago. The humans had submitted very specific requirements for their delegation space: adequate lighting, breathable atmosphere, and somewhere to sit that doesn't float, glow, or require tentacles to operate. Ambassador Riley occupied the central position, a woman in her late 30s wearing what appeared to be a meticulously pressed military-style uniform in deep navy blue. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that suggested she took regulations seriously, and her green eyes held the particular brand of patient expression worn by people who had spent considerable time dealing with bureaucracy. To her left sat Dr. Peterson, identified in the delegation roster as scientific advisor, though his actual function remained mysteriously undefined. To her right was the designated spokesman, Kethvar of the Kethran Collective, a tall, blue-skinned humanoid who had volunteered for the position after extensive experience managing primitive species, as per Galactic Protocol 847 Delta, High Chancellor Vextora continued. "The human delegation operates under modified silence doctrine. The designated representative will communicate on their behalf until such time as the species demonstrates sufficient understanding of galactic legislative procedures." The modified silence doctrine was the Senate's latest innovation in dealing with problematic new members. Rather than the traditional approach of letting primitive species embarrass themselves publicly, the new system assigned experienced diplomats to speak for them. It had worked wonderfully with the Zethais, who spent most of their time in hibernation anyway, and the crystalline Velturans, who communicated primarily through harmonic resonance that most species found deeply annoying. "The chair recognizes spokesman Kethvar to present the human position on Resolution 4471B regarding standardized atmospheric composition in public spaces." Kethvar rose gracefully, his translator badge gleaming as it adjusted to optimal frequency. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying human culture through their limited cultural exchanges, and preparing what he considered to be an appropriately primitive response to the Senate inquiry. "Honored senators," he began, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who had practiced this speech extensively, "the humans of Earth express their gratitude for inclusion in this august body. They humbly submit that their atmospheric requirements are simple and should not burden the Senate's wisdom." Behind him, Ambassador Riley's expression didn't change, but Dr. Peterson made a small notation on a device that definitely wasn't standard Senate equipment. "They require approximately 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and various trace gases that their primitive biology demands for survival. They understand that this may require special accommodations and are willing to provide supplemental atmospheric processing for their delegation area." Several senators nodded approvingly. This was exactly the sort of reasonable, deferential response they expected from a properly managed primitive species. Kethvar continued, warming to his theme. "The humans also wish to express their understanding that their inclusion in this body is provisional. pending their development of sufficient sophistication to participate meaningfully in galactic governance. That's when Ambassador Riley turned to Dr. Peterson and said, in a voice that carried perfectly across the chamber's acoustics, "Did he just call us too stupid to breathe?" The translation systems, which had been humming along quietly, suddenly emitted a series of confused chirps and electronic hiccups as they attempted to process a direct statement from someone who wasn't supposed to be speaking. Kethbar turned around, his expression a mixture of shock and diplomatic panic. "Ambassador, you are not permitted to—" "Oh, I'm sorry," Riley said, standing up with the fluid motion of someone who had spent considerable time in military service. "I wasn't aware that asking for clarification violated your parliamentary procedure. Where I come from, when someone misrepresents your position, it's considered polite to correct them." The translation systems were now making sounds that could best be described as mechanical distress. Half the chamber's representatives were frantically consulting their diplomatic protocols, while the other half were leaning forward with the expression of people watching a traffic accident unfold in slow motion. High Chancellor Vextor's staff hit his desk with a crystalline chime that usually restored order to the chamber. Today, it seemed to have the opposite effect. "The human representative will observe silence doctrine protocols," he announced, though his voice carried less authority than usual. "All communications will proceed through the designated spokesman." Riley smiled, an expression that made several species reach for their emergency communicators. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was Dr. Peterson standing up and saying, "Actually, we need to discuss that." The translation systems throughout the Senate chamber began emitting what could only be described as electronic screams of confusion. Ambassador Riley's words had apparently broken something fundamental in the linguistic processing matrix, because instead of converting her statement into the 47 different languages represented in the chamber, the systems were displaying error messages in scripts that didn't correspond to any known civilization. "What exactly," Riley said, her voice carrying with the kind of authority that made career diplomats nervous, "is the legal basis for the silence doctrine?" High Chancellor Vextora's crystalline staff trembled in his grip. In 8 centuries of Senate operation, no one had ever asked that question. The silence doctrine simply was a foundational principle of galactic governance that had existed since the formation of the legislative body. "The doctrine is established precedent," he replied, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "It ensures orderly integration of primitive species into galactic civilization." "Primitive species," Riley repeated, and somehow she managed to make those 2 words sound like a legal challenge. "I'm curious about that designation. What criteria determine primitiveness?" The translation systems had given up entirely, and were now simply broadcasting Riley's words in their original language, while displaying increasingly frantic error codes in the alien scripts. Several representatives were frantically consulting portable translation devices, while others appeared to be understanding her perfectly despite the technological failure. Dr. Peterson opened what appeared to be a briefcase and extracted a device that definitely hadn't been included in the approved equipment list. "For the record, we've been monitoring galactic communications for the past 3 months. Would you like me to play back the Senate's discussion about Earth's developmental limitations?" The chamber fell into the kind of silence usually reserved for moments of impending catastrophe. "That's classified," Senator Velthak of the Dominion Collective announced, his tentacles writhing with agitation. "No primitive species has access to Senate internal communications." "Primitive," Riley said again, this time with a smile that made the emergency lighting seem inadequate. "There's that word again. Dr. Peterson, would you mind sharing our communication intercept capabilities with our esteemed colleagues?" The device in Peterson's hands projected a holographic display that showed real-time communication traffic throughout the Senate chamber. Not just the official channels, everything. Private messages between representatives, security protocols, even what appeared to be lunch orders from the Senate cafeteria. "We've been listening to everything for 3 months, Peterson said conversationally. "Your encryption is really quite primitive. I mean, by our standards. High Chancellor Vextore's staff hit the floor with a crystalline crack that suggested it wasn't designed for emergency impacts. Impossible, Senator Kethral of the Scientific Consortium declared, his multiple eyes dilating in what his species expressed as intellectual panic. Our communication systems use quantum-encrypted subspace channels. No primitive technology could— Could what? Riley interrupted. Could intercept communications using technology you don't understand. Could build devices that your sensors can't detect. Could sit quietly in your little corner for 3 months while you debated whether we're sophisticated enough to use proper silverware. The revelation that humans had been violating the fundamental assumptions of galactic security for 3 months was spreading through the chamber like a particularly virulent form of diplomatic plague. Representatives were frantically activating emergency protocols, while others appeared to be having what could charitably be called nervous breakdowns. Furthermore, Riley continued, apparently warming to her theme, we've been somewhat confused by the legal framework that supposedly governs our participation in this body. Dr. Peterson, could you remind me when Earth formally agreed to join the Galactic Senate? Dr. Peterson consulted his device with the casual manner of someone checking the weather. According to our records, Earth has never submitted an application for Senate membership, never signed any galactic treaties, and never agreed to be bound by Senate law. Then how— High Chancellor Vextera began. How are we here? Riley finished. Excellent question. According to your own records, which we've also been monitoring, the Senate voted to include Earth as a member species following what you classified as successful first contact. The problem is that the successful first contact never actually happened. The chamber's emergency lighting activated automatically as representatives began triggering panic protocols. The beings you contacted 3 months ago and classified as Earth's diplomatic representatives were actually our janitors, Riley continued. Maintenance workers who were cleaning the communication relay station when your first contact team arrived. They were quite polite about the whole thing, but they're not actually authorized to sign treaties on behalf of our government. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Senator Vexkol of the Trade Federation, quietly updating his will on his personal device. This is preposterous, Senator Veltak declared, though his tentacles were now writhing in what appeared to be existential crisis. The Galactic Senate does not make mistakes of this magnitude. Oh, but it gets better, Riley said, and her smile was now approaching what military personnel would recognize as tactical-grade intimidation. When your Senate voted to include Earth, you automatically applied your standard legislative package to our home system. Taxation frameworks, resource allocation protocols, military service requirements, the whole bureaucratic nightmare. Dr. Peterson's device updated its display to show financial records that made several senators reach for their emergency communicators. You've been charging us taxes for 3 months, Riley announced. Taxes we never agreed to pay for services we never requested to a government we never joined. Dr. Peterson, what's our current outstanding balance? According to Senate records, Earth owes approximately 47 billion standard credits in membership fees, infrastructure assessments, and late payment penalties. High Chancellor Vextora was now holding his broken staff like a weapon, though against what remained unclear. Senate security, he called, his voice carrying the particular desperation of someone whose career was dissolving in real time. Arrest the human representatives for violation of the silence doctrine and unauthorized access to classified information. 6 armed guards entered the chamber, wearing the distinctive armor of Senate enforcement personnel. They approached the human delegation with the confident stride of beings who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with superior firepower. That's when Riley pulled out a document that made the translation systems start smoking. I'm afraid that won't be possible, she said, holding up what appeared to be an official Senate form. Earth formally claims diplomatic immunity under Section 4, subsection 12 of the Galactic Legal Code, which states that no member species can be prosecuted for violations of laws they were not present to vote on. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that the form was signed, dated, and had been filed in the Senate's legal database 3 months ago. What happened next made galactic history, and not in a good way. The smoking translation systems were the least of the Senate's problems. Riley's diplomatic immunity claim had triggered something that hadn't happened in the 800-year history of galactic governance, a complete legal paradox that made the Chamber's AI arbitration systems start displaying error messages in languages that predated most civilizations. "The form is authentic," announced the Senate's chief legal advisor, a crystalline being whose species had evolved specifically to process complex legal frameworks. His voice carried the particular tone of someone whose entire worldview had just been fed through a bureaucratic shredder. "Filed under Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha, which allows preemptive diplomatic protection for species facing potential legal persecution." High Chancellor Vexto stared at the document display with the expression of someone watching their retirement plans spontaneously combust. "Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha requires Senate approval. No such approval was granted." "Actually," Riley said, pulling out what appeared to be a portable legal database, "Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha can be automatically triggered when a species demonstrates that their inclusion in Senate governance occurred without proper consent." Which brings us to an interesting question about the validity of every Senate action regarding Earth for the past 3 months. Dr. Peterson's device updated its display to show a cascade of legal documents, each one triggering additional complications that made the Chamber's legal processing systems emit increasingly distressed electronic sounds. According to Galactic Legal Code Section 12, any legislative action taken without proper species representation is null and void, Riley continued, apparently reading from her device while several senators quietly began activating emergency evacuation protocols. This includes taxation, resource allocation, military conscription requirements, and, oh, this is interesting, membership itself. "That's impossible," Senator Catherall protested, his multiple eyes now dilating in perfect synchronization. "The Senate has been operating under established legal precedent for centuries." "Has it, though?" Riley asked, and her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Dr. Peterson, could you show them our analysis of Senate legal precedent?" The holographic display expanded to fill half the chamber, showing a complex legal flowchart that appeared to be held together with wishful thinking and bureaucratic inertia. Red warning indicators appeared throughout the structure, highlighting fundamental contradictions that had been overlooked for centuries. "Your legal framework," Dr. Peterson explained conversationally, "contains approximately 3,000 internal contradictions, 1,700 circular references, and what can only be described as a complete failure to establish basic constitutional authority. The Senate's authority derives from the consent of member species," Senator Velthak declared, though his tentacles were now tied in what appeared to be nervous knots. "Does it?" Riley asked. "Because according to your own records, 37 of your 47 member species were included through the same successful first contact protocol that was used for Earth. How many of those contacts were actually authorized by the species' legitimate governments?" A silence that followed was broken by the sound of Senator Zefkai quietly accessing the Emergency Legal Council database. "Furthermore," Riley continued, apparently just getting started, "your taxation system violates the fundamental principle of representation that most civilized governments consider basic. You've been collecting taxes from species that have no voting rights, no representation in Senate leadership, and no meaningful input into the laws that govern them." High Chancellor Vextora's ceremonial robes were now displaying stress patterns that suggested their emotional monitoring systems were overloading. "The Senate provides protection and services to member species." "What services?" Riley interrupted. "Defense against what? Trade regulation of whom? You're running what appears to be a protection racket disguised as a government, collecting taxes from species you've unilaterally declared to be your subjects." Dr. Peterson's display updated to show financial records that made several representatives reach for their personal legal counsel. "The Senate has collected approximately 4.7 trillion standard credits in taxes over the past century from species that never agreed to be taxed." The constitutional crisis was now spreading through the chamber like a particularly virulent form of legal plague. Representatives were frantically consulting emergency protocols, while others appeared to be having what could charitably be called existential breakdowns about the legitimacy of their entire governmental structure. "Senate security," High Chancellor Vextora called, though his voice now carried the desperation of someone whose authority was dissolving in real time. "Arrest the humans for sedition and incitement to governmental collapse." The security forces, who had been advancing on the human delegation, stopped mid-stride as Riley held up another document. "I'm afraid that's not possible either," she said pleasantly. "Earth formally claims sovereign immunity under the Universal Rights Charter Section 3, which protects species from prosecution by governmental bodies they didn't consent to join. The Universal Rights Charter was abolished 3 centuries ago," Senator Kethrel protested. "Was it?" Riley asked. "Because according to Galactic Legal Code Section 47, international treaties can only be modified with the consent of all signatory species." "Dr. Peterson, how many species consented to the Charter's abolition?" "According to Senate records, 0. The Charter was simply declared obsolete by Senate vote, with no input from the affected species. The legal paradox was now complete. The Senate had spent 3 centuries operating under the assumption that they had the authority to modify laws that they had never actually been given permission to change by species that had never agreed to grant them that authority in the first place. "But that's not the really interesting part," Riley said, and her smile was now approaching what career diplomats would recognize as diplomatic-grade weaponization. "The really interesting part is what our cultural advisors have been doing for the past 3 months." She gestured toward Dr. Peterson, who activated a new display that made the chamber's emergency lighting seem inadequate. "While you've been debating our primitive status," Peterson announced, "we've been conducting a comprehensive legal audit of galactic governance. Every treaty, every law, every governmental structure you've built over the past 8 centuries." The display showed a galaxy-wide map with legal violations highlighted in red. There was a lot of red. 43 of your member species were included without proper governmental consent. Your taxation system violates the sovereignty rights of 37 civilizations. Your military conscription protocols constitute forced labor under 14 different interspecies treaties that are still legally binding. And your silence doctrine, Riley added, violates the basic communication rights established by the Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights, which was signed by every founding member of the original Galactic Alliance. The silence that followed was broken by Senator Vexkol, quietly requesting emergency legal representation for his entire civilization. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was Riley pulling out a final document that made the translation systems catch fire. On behalf of the 43 species whose membership was obtained through fraudulent means, she announced, Earth formally files a class action lawsuit against the Galactic Senate for 8 centuries of unauthorized governance. The alarms weren't for security breaches or system failures. They were for governmental collapse, specifically the complete legal dissolution of 8 centuries of galactic governance, triggered by a class action lawsuit filed by someone who wasn't supposed to be able to speak. High Chancellor Vextora stood amid the chaos, watching his life's work crumble while emergency protocols activated throughout the chamber. Representatives were frantically contacting their home governments, requesting instructions for a situation that had never occurred in galactic history. The complete invalidation of their governmental structure by superior paperwork. "This is impossible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The Senate cannot simply cease to exist because of legal technicalities." "Actually," Riley said, consulting her portable legal database while the chamber descended into controlled panic around her, "that's exactly how governments work. They exist by consent of the governed, and when that consent is withdrawn, they stop being governments and become very expensive social clubs with delusions of authority." Dr. Peterson's device was now displaying what appeared to be real-time updates from across the galaxy, as the legal implications of Riley's lawsuit spread through interstellar communication networks. 43 species were simultaneously discovering that their membership in galactic civilization had been fraudulent from the beginning. "The humans request an immediate recess," Riley announced, "to allow the Senate time to determine whether it has any legal authority to be making decisions about anything." But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part came when Senator Veltek asked, "Who are you people really?" Riley's smile shifted into something that career diplomats would recognize as the expression worn by people who had been waiting for exactly that question. "I'm Ambassador Riley Thompson, Harvard Law School, specializing in interspecies constitutional law. Dr. Peterson here is actually Dr. Marcus Peterson, former Secretary of State and current Director of Earth's Department of Xenopolitical Affairs. And this," she gestured toward their previously silent third companion, "is Admiral Lisa Park, Director of Human Intelligence Operations." Admiral Park stood for the first time, revealing a bearing that suggested she was accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "We represent the actual government of Earth, which has been monitoring galactic civilization for the past 47 years. The admission hit the chamber like a diplomatic nuclear weapon. Earth hadn't stumbled into galactic politics by accident. They'd been studying it for decades. 47 years, High Chancellor Vextvar repeated weakly. "Your first contact protocols are impressively bad," Admiral Park explained. "When your scouts arrived in our solar system in 2377, they made contact with a maintenance crew at a communication relay station and declared it successful first contact with Earth's government. We found this so amusing that we decided to see how far your bureaucratic incompetence would go. The revelation that Earth had been conducting a 47-year intelligence operation disguised as diplomatic confusion was spreading through the chamber's communications systems. Several representatives were quietly requesting emergency consultations with their respective intelligence agencies, while others appeared to be having existential crises about the competence of their own first contact procedures. "The maintenance crew," Senator Kethrall said slowly. "Were they actually—" "Oh, they were definitely maintenance workers," Admiral Park confirmed. "Jimmy Rodriguez and Susan Miller specifically. They were cleaning the satellite array when your people showed up and started talking about galactic civilization. Jimmy thought you were either elaborate pranksters or possibly having some kind of shared psychotic episode." Dr. Peterson pulled up another display showing communication logs that made several senators reach for emergency anxiety medication. "The initial contact report filed by your scouts described Earth as a primitive agrarian society with basic technological development. This was based on a 40-minute conversation with two people whose primary qualifications were knowing how to replace communication array components and having access to really good coffee. We've been using those initial assessments as the basis for Earth's classification for 3 months, High Chancellor Vextora said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, and it's been hilarious," Riley replied. "Watching you debate whether humans are sophisticated enough to understand basic governmental concepts while we've been systematically documenting every legal violation in your constitutional framework." Dr. Peterson's display updated to show a timeline that made several senators quietly update their insurance policies. "Earth has had observer teams embedded in galactic civilization for 5 decades. We've been watching your governmental processes, studying your legal frameworks, and documenting every constitutional violation you've committed. We've also been conducting similar legal audits for every species in the galaxy," Riley added. "Turns out, most civilizations are very interested to learn that they never actually agreed to join your interstellar bureaucracy." The Chamber's communications systems were now broadcasting emergency sessions from across the galaxy as species after species began reviewing their own membership status. The political implications were spreading faster than the Senate's ability to contain them. "What do you want?" High Chancellor Vextor asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Want?" Riley laughed, and the sound carried across the chamber's acoustics with the particular quality of someone who found the question genuinely amusing. "We want you to do your jobs properly. Run a government that actually represents its members, collect taxes with proper consent, and stop pretending that bureaucratic efficiency is a substitute for democratic legitimacy. Also," Admiral Park added, "we want our 47 billion credits back, with interest." The Senate's attempt to rewrite their constitution in real time was complicated by the fact that humans kept finding loopholes faster than the legal drafting committees could close them. Every proposed framework was immediately analyzed by Earth's legal team and returned with detailed explanations of how it violated fundamental principles of governmental authority. Article 12, Section 4 creates a taxation framework without establishing representation requirements, Riley would announce. Article 15 grants the Senate authority to modify its own constitutional limitations, which violates the principle of limited government. Article 23 allows the conscription of member species for military service without their specific consent, which constitutes slavery under 17 different interspecies treaties. The Constitutional Convention lasted 6 weeks, during which Earth's legal team systematically dismantled every attempt to create a functional galactic government. The final draft was 47 pages long and contained more restrictions on Senate authority than actual powers. "This is impossible," complained Senator Kethrall during the final review session. "Under these restrictions, the Senate can barely function." "Now you're getting it," Riley replied cheerfully. "The point of constitutional government is to make it difficult for politicians to do things without proper authorization. If it's easy for you to pass laws, you're probably doing it wrong." The new Galactic Confederation was officially established 3 months later, with a motto that reflected the lessons learned from 8 centuries of bureaucratic overreach. Maybe we should have asked what Earth actually wanted. The ceremony was held on Earth, specifically because 43 species had voted that they trusted human legal oversight more than they trusted their former Senate overlords. High Chancellor Vextora, now serving as administrative coordinator under a carefully limited mandate, read the new governmental charter to an audience that included representatives from every member species. "The Galactic Confederation acknowledges that legitimate government derives from the consent of the governed," he read, his voice carrying the weight of institutional humility. "All member species participate voluntarily and retain the right to withdraw their consent at any time." Ambassador Riley sat in the front row, no longer bound by any silence doctrine, watching the proceedings with the satisfied expression of someone whose job was finally complete. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the final clause of the new charter. All legal disputes will be resolved by the Earth Legal Review Board because apparently they're the only ones who actually read the fine print. The woman who wasn't supposed to speak had just become the galaxy's chief legal officer by pointing out that nobody had ever asked if Earth wanted to join their club in the first place. And somewhere in the audience, Dr. Peterson was already taking notes for the inevitable sequel, How to Run a Galaxy Without Accidentally Starting a Revolution.